When widowed Irish immigrant Mary O'Brien arrives at James Hartwell's Wyoming ranch in 1881 to restore his late wife's abandoned garden, she expects nothing more than honest work and fair pay. But as their careful professional boundaries dissolve into something deeper, a ruthless land baron threatens to destroy everything they're building together, forcing them to choose between safety and the love that's taken root between them like the hardiest of plants. Will their newfound connection be strong enough to survive when powerful enemies decide that some gardens are worth burning to claim the land beneath them? The dead rabbit hung from the fence post like a warning, its blood still fresh in the cold Wyoming morning air of September 1881. Mary Catherine O'Brien stopped walking and stared at the cruel message someone had left for her. 3 days in this territory, and already trouble had found her. She pulled her thin coat tighter and kept walking toward the ranch house in the distance. The mountains stood tall around the valley, their peaks white with early snow. Smoke rose from the chimney of a log cabin ahead, and she could smell bacon cooking. Her stomach growled loudly. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. The letter in her pocket crinkled as she walked. Woman needed for garden work. Must be strong. Good pay. Simple words that had brought her hundreds of miles from the crowded streets of Denver to this wild place where anything could happen. Mary had seen enough death in her 28 years. The fever that took her husband Patrick back in Ireland. The long, hard journey across the ocean in a ship's belly with too many people and not enough food. The mean streets of New York where a woman alone was always in danger. But she had learned to keep going, to put one foot in front of the other even when everything seemed hopeless. A dog barked somewhere near the house. Then she heard a man's voice telling it to be quiet. The voice sounded tired, like someone who had forgotten how to laugh. As she got closer, Mary could see what used to be a garden. Weeds grew wild where vegetables should have been. Broken fence posts leaned at crazy angles. Dead vines hung like old rags from poles that once held up healthy plants. It looked like no one had cared for this place in a very long time. You lost. The voice made her jump. A man stood in the doorway of the barn, holding a pitchfork like he might need to use it for more than moving hay. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they looked at her with the careful attention of someone who expected trouble. "I'm Mary O'Brien," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I came about the garden work." The man studied her for a long moment. Mary knew what he saw: a woman with work-rough hands, a dress that had been mended too many times, and shoes with thin soles. But she stood straight and met his gaze without backing down. "Name's Hartwell. James Hartwell." He gestured toward the ruined garden with his chin. "That's what needs fixing. My wife Anna used to tend it, but she's been gone 2 years now. Can you handle work like that?" Mary looked at the mess of weeds and broken dreams. She had brought dying farms back to life before. She knew how to coax green things from stubborn soil, how to make plants grow where others said nothing would ever flourish again. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, pulling off her gloves to show hands marked by years of hard work. "I've made gardens bloom in ground that other folks called cursed. I've fed families through winters that broke stronger people than me. If you're asking if I can fix this, the answer is yes." Something flickered in James's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or hope that he was trying not to feel. "The work's hard. The pay's $3 a week plus meals. You'll need to provide your own lodging in town." He paused, watching her face. "And there might be complications. Some folks around here don't take kindly to strangers." Mary thought about the dead rabbit and wondered if James Hartwell knew more about these complications than he was saying. But she needed this job, and something about this broken place called to her. Maybe it was because she understood what it felt like to be abandoned and forgotten. "When do I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow at sunrise. Don't be late." As Mary walked back toward town, she felt eyes watching her from somewhere in the hills. The feeling crawled up her spine like a cold finger. She had learned to trust her instincts about danger, and right now they were screaming that coming to this valley might have been a terrible mistake. But she had made her choice. Tomorrow she would begin the work of bringing something dead back to life. She just hoped she would live long enough to see it bloom. The sound of gunshots cracked across the valley like thunder, jolting Mary awake in her small room above the general store. She pressed her face to the window and saw orange flames dancing in the distance, right where the Hartwell ranch sat in the darkness. Her heart pounded as she threw on her clothes and ran through the empty streets of town. No one else seemed to have heard the shots, or maybe they had learned not to get involved in other people's troubles. By the time she reached the ranch, the fire was out, but the smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. James stood in front of his barn, a bucket in his hands and soot streaking his face. The building was still standing, but scorch marks climbed up one wall like black fingers. What happened? Mary gasped, out of breath from running. Someone decided to send me a message, James said, his voice flat and dangerous. Lucky I was awake. Few more minutes and the whole barn would have gone up. Mary looked around the yard, noting details that told a story of violence. Broken glass near the house. Horse tracks that didn't belong to James's animals. A pitchfork stuck deep in the ground like a spear, its handle still quivering. Who would do this? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. Could be anyone, James said, but his eyes told a different story. Lot of folks think a man alone can't hold on to land like this. They might be right. The defeat in his voice made Mary angry. She had come here to tend a garden, not to watch good people get driven away by bullies and cowards. But as she looked at James, really looked at him in the flickering light from his lantern, she saw something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she hadn't felt since Patrick died. James Hartwell was a man worth fighting for. Show me the garden tools, she said suddenly. James blinked in surprise. What? The tools? Your wife's tools. If I'm going to bring this place back to life, I need to understand what I'm working with. James led her to a small shed behind the house. Inside, Mary found treasures that made her hands itch to get started. Hand tools worn smooth by years of use. Seed packets carefully stored in glass jars. A small notebook filled with Anna Hartwell's neat handwriting, recording what grew well and what didn't, which plants helped each other and which ones fought. She loved this place, Mary said softly, running her finger along the spine of the notebook. More than she loved me sometimes, James replied with a bitter laugh. I used to get jealous of the time she spent out there, talking to plants like they were children. Mary looked up at him. Plants do better when you talk to them. Makes them feel wanted. That's what Anna always said. James picked up a small trowel, its handle carved with initials. H. Anna Hartwell. I made this for her the summer we got married. The sadness in his voice was so deep that Mary wanted to reach out and touch his face, to tell him that grief was just love with nowhere to go. But she kept her hands to herself and focused on the tools instead. These are good tools, she said. Well cared for. They'll serve again if you let them. I haven't been able to. James started, then stopped. After Anna died, I couldn't bear to touch anything she had loved. Seemed wrong somehow. Mary understood. She still had Patrick's shaving brush, wrapped in paper and tucked away where she couldn't see it every day. Some things hurt too much to hold on to, but were too precious to let go. Maybe, she said carefully, it's time to let love grow something new. James looked at her then, really looked at her, and Mary felt her cheeks grow warm under his gaze. There was something building between them, something that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. But before either of them could speak, the sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Get behind me, James whispered, reaching for a rifle that leaned against the shed wall. But Mary had survived too much to hide behind anyone now. She picked up a heavy hoe and stood beside James as three riders emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden by hat brims and shadows. Hartwell, one of them called out. We need to talk. Talk fast, James replied, his rifle pointed steady at the lead rider. It's been a long night. The rider laughed, a sound like broken glass. Heard you had some excitement earlier. Shame about your barn. Could have been worse, though. Could have been your house. Or your lady friend there. Mary's blood turned to ice water. These men weren't just threatening James, they were threatening her too. And suddenly she understood that whatever was happening here was bigger and more dangerous than a simple land dispute. The lead rider urged his horse closer, and Mary caught a glimpse of his face in the moonlight. Cold eyes, cruel mouth, the kind of man who enjoyed other people's fear. "You've got 1 week, Hartwell," the writer said. "1 week to pack up and move on. After that, we can't guarantee your safety, or the safety of anyone foolish enough to stand with you." As quickly as they had come, the riders vanished into the night, leaving Mary and James alone with the smell of smoke and the taste of fear. But Mary surprised herself by feeling something else too. A fierce determination to protect this place and this man who had somehow become important to her in just 2 days. "James," she said quietly, "I think we're going to need more than garden tools to fix what's broken here." The scream that split the morning air wasn't human. It was James's prize bull, caught in barbed wire that someone had strung across the creek during the night. Mary dropped her coffee cup and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Blood streaked the animal's legs where the cruel wire had cut deep. The bull's eyes rolled white with pain and fear as it struggled, making the cuts worse with every movement. James was already there, trying to calm the massive creature while working to free it from the deadly trap. "Easy, Thunder," James whispered, his voice steady despite the anger Mary could see burning in his jaw. "We'll get you out of this mess." Mary grabbed wire cutters from James's belt and began snipping the barbed strands, her hands shaking with rage. This wasn't just an attack on livestock. This was torture, designed to cause maximum suffering and send a clear message. "Who would do something so evil?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The same people who burned my barn," James replied grimly. "They're trying to break me one piece at a time." As they worked to free Thunder, Mary noticed something that made her stomach clench with fear. Fresh horse tracks led away from the creek, but they also circled around toward the house. Someone had been watching them, studying their routines, learning their weaknesses. "James," she said quietly, "I think we're being hunted." The words hung between them like a dark cloud. After they doctored Thunder's wounds and led him to safety, James and Mary walked back to the house in silence, both lost in thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. Inside the kitchen, Mary tried to focus on making breakfast, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. She had fled Ireland to escape violence, crossed an ocean to find peace, and traveled west to start over. But somehow trouble had found her again. "You should leave," James said suddenly, startling her out of her dark thoughts. "Pack your things and catch the next stage out of town." "This isn't your fight, Mary." The words hit her like a slap. Mary set down the pan she was holding and turned to face him, her green eyes flashing with hurt and determination. "So that's it? When things get difficult, you just send me away like some hired hand who's outlived her usefulness." "That's not what I meant, Dash." "Then what did you mean?" Mary demanded. "Because it sounds like you're deciding what's best for me without bothering to ask what I want." James ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older than his 35 years. "Mary, these people are dangerous. They've already killed my cattle and burned my property. I won't have your blood on my hands too." "My blood is my own concern," Mary shot back. "I've faced down landlords who burned families out of their homes for sport. I've survived fever ships and city streets where women disappeared every night. I'm not some delicate flower that wilts at the first sign of trouble." The fire in her voice seemed to surprise James. He looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as someone who needed protection, but as someone who had already proven she could protect herself. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why would you stay and risk everything for a place that isn't even yours?" Mary considered the question, thinking about all the reasons she could give. The garden that was finally starting to bloom under her care. The sense of purpose she felt here. The way James looked at her sometimes, like she was something precious and rare. But in the end, she settled on the simplest truth. "Because this feels like home," she said. "And I'm tired of running from fights that follow me anyway." Something shifted in James's expression. The careful distance he'd maintained began to crack, revealing glimpses of the man underneath the grief and fear. "If you stay," he said slowly, "things are going to get worse before they get better. These people won't stop until they get what they want. Then we'd better figure out what they want and why, Mary replied. Knowledge is the best weapon against an enemy. James nodded slowly, and Mary saw him make a decision that would change both their lives. There's something I haven't told you, he admitted. Something about this land that makes it valuable to certain people. Mary waited, sensing that whatever James was about to reveal would explain everything. The attacks, the threats, the desperation she sometimes saw in his eyes. Railroad surveyors came through here last spring, James continued. They were mapping a route for the new line coming west. According to their measurements, the railroad will need to cross my property to reach the mining camps in the mountains. The pieces began falling into place in Mary's mind. And whoever controls your land controls the railroad's access to millions of dollars worth of silver and gold, James finished. The railroad company would pay a fortune for the right-of-way, or they'd pay almost as much to buy the land outright. Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. How many people know about this? The surveyors, the railroad company, and Samuel Fletcher, the man who's been trying to buy me out for months. He must have gotten word somehow. Fletcher, Mary repeated, filing the name away. The one behind the attacks? I can't prove it, but yes. He owns most of the land in this valley already. Mine is the last piece he needs to control the entire route. Mary walked to the window and looked out at the garden where she'd spent the last week coaxing life from neglected soil. Everything made sense now. The escalating violence, the careful timing of the attacks, the cold calculation behind each move. He's not just trying to scare you off, she realized. He's trying to make you desperate enough to sell cheap, or crazy enough that people will say you're not fit to own land. Smart woman, James said with grudging admiration. Anna always said I should trust female intuition more. The mention of his dead wife created a moment of awkward silence. Mary wondered, not for the first time, what Anna Hartwell had been like. Beautiful, probably. Gentle and refined. Everything that Mary wasn't. The kind of woman who belonged in a man's heart. Not the rough Irish immigrant who'd stumbled into James's life by accident. Tell me about her, Mary said suddenly. About Anna. James looked surprised by the request. Why? Because she's part of this place, part of you. If I'm going to stay and fight for what you've built here, I need to understand what I'm protecting. For a moment, Mary thought James would refuse. Then he walked to a small cabinet and pulled out a daguerreotype in a silver frame. The woman in the picture was indeed beautiful, with soft features and kind eyes. But there was also strength in her face, a determination that Mary recognized. Anna was the strongest person I ever knew, James said quietly. She came west with her family when she was 16. Lost both parents to cholera the first winter. Could have given up, could have gone back east to relatives who would have taken her in. But she stayed, worked as a seamstress in town, saved every penny until she could buy her own plot of land. She was a fighter, Mary observed. A survivor, James corrected. Like you. The comparison made Mary's chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition, or something deeper and more dangerous that she wasn't ready to examine. What would she think? Mary asked. About me being here, I mean. James was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft Mary had to strain to hear it. Anna always said the heart was like her garden, could grow new things even in soil that had known loss. But only if someone was brave enough to plant seeds and tend them with care. The words hung between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Mary felt something shift inside her chest, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. But before either of them could say more, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. This time, it wasn't 3 riders in the dark. It was a dozen men in broad daylight, riding hard toward the ranch with the purposeful intent of people who had come to finish what they'd started. Get the rifles, James said, his voice suddenly sharp with command. This isn't a social call. The bullet that shattered the kitchen window missed Mary's head by inches, embedding itself in the wall where her grandmother's cross had hung just moments before. Glass exploded across the floor like deadly rain as she dove behind the heavy oak table that had suddenly become her shield. Stay down, James shouted from his position near the front door, his rifle already speaking its own language of defiance into the chaos outside. Through the broken window, Mary could see men positioned behind the barn, the well, and the old wagon, every piece of cover that would give them clean shots at the house. These weren't the midnight raiders who had burned the barn. These were professionals moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers or hired killers. "Hartwell," a voice boomed across the yard. "You've got 10 minutes to come out with your hands up. After that, we start burning everything you love." Mary recognized the voice from that terrible night, the cold, cruel man who had threatened them both. But now there was something different in his tone, something final and absolute that made her blood freeze. "Fletcher," James called back, "this is still my land. You've got no right dash." His words were cut off by another volley of gunfire that turned the morning air into a storm of lead and splinters. Mary pressed herself against the floor and tried to think. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a house that was quickly becoming a death trap. But she hadn't survived this long by giving up when things looked hopeless. Crawling on her belly, Mary made her way to the back door while James kept the attackers busy with return fire. Her plan was simple and desperate: circle around behind the barn while they were focused on the house, then try to even the odds. The Spencer rifle that James had given her felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands, but Mary had learned to shoot during the hard years after Patrick's death. A woman alone needed every advantage she could get, and pride was a luxury that dead people couldn't afford. She slipped out the back door and began working her way through the tall grass toward the barn, using every scrap of cover she could find. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure the whole valley could hear it, but she forced herself to move slowly and carefully. From her new position, Mary could see the full scope of Fletcher's operation. 12 men, well-armed and positioned to cover every escape route. But they had made one mistake. They were all focused on the house, expecting James to either surrender or die inside his own walls. None of them were watching for a woman with a rifle and nothing left to lose. Mary chose her target carefully, a man crouched behind the water trough, his back turned toward her hiding spot. She had never shot another human being before, but as she thought about thunder tangled in barbed wire and the dead rabbit left as a warning, she found that her hands were steady. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder. The man behind the water trough spun and fell, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. In the confusion that followed, Mary managed to put 2 more bullets into the group before they figured out where the attack was coming from. "Behind the barn!" someone shouted. "There's another shooter behind the barn." Suddenly half of Fletcher's men were turning their guns toward Mary's position, and she found herself pinned down behind a pile of old fence posts that wouldn't stop a determined rabbit, let alone rifle bullets. This was how she was going to die, Mary realized with strange calm. Not in a fever ship or a city alley, but in a ranch yard in Wyoming, fighting for a place that had become more important to her than her own life. But then she heard something that made her heart leap with hope, the sound of more gunfire, coming from a completely different direction. Through the chaos and smoke, she saw new figures moving through the trees beyond the creek, firing at Fletcher's men with deadly accuracy. "It's the sheriff," James shouted from the house. Morrison brought help. Mary had never been so happy to see a badge in her life. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies had arrived like cavalry in one of those dime novels, but their guns were real and their aim was true. Fletcher's carefully planned attack began falling apart as his men found themselves caught between 3 different groups of shooters. "This is the law," Morrison's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Throw down your weapons and surrender." Some of Fletcher's men did exactly that, raising their hands and stepping away from their guns. But Fletcher himself and his core group of hired killers had too much at stake to give up easily. They began fighting their way toward their horses, shooting at anything that moved. Mary saw her chance and took it. While Fletcher was distracted by the deputies, she sprinted from cover toward the house, her rifle ready for anything. She almost made it to safety when a figure stepped out from behind the chicken coop. His gun pointed straight at her heart. It was Fletcher himself, his face twisted with rage and defeat. "You," he snarled. "This is all your fault. If you hadn't come here, Hartwell would have sold out months ago. Maybe, Mary replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. But I did come here and I'm not leaving. Fletcher's finger tightened on the trigger, and Mary knew she was out of time and options. But before either of them could fire, another shot rang out from the direction of the house. Fletcher staggered backward, his gun flying from nerveless fingers as James's bullet found its mark. "Nobody threatens my wife," James said grimly, stepping out of the house with smoke still curling from his rifle barrel. "Wife." The word hit Mary like a physical blow, even though she knew James had said it to protect her, to give his actions the weight of law and custom. But hearing it spoken aloud made something inside her chest flutter like a bird taking flight. As the smoke cleared and the deputies rounded up the last of Fletcher's men, Mary found herself staring at James across the bullet-scarred yard. They had survived something terrible together, but now she wondered what came next. Where did they go from here? What did this morning mean for whatever was growing between them? "Mary," James said quietly, walking toward her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "About what I said." "I know," she replied quickly. "You were protecting me. I understand." "No," James said, stopping just close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his storm-gray eyes. "I wasn't protecting you. I was telling the truth. Or at least, the truth I want to be real." Mary felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that watching you fight for this place, for me, for us, Mary, I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to make that word real. I'd like you to be my wife, not just in name but in every way that matters." The proposal hung between them like a bridge spanning a great distance. Mary looked at this man who had just risked everything to save her life, who was offering her not just his name but his heart and his future. "James Hartwell," she said, reaching out to touch his face with trembling fingers. "I thought you'd never ask." Their kiss tasted of gunpowder and hope, of two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and chosen love anyway. Around them, the valley stretched toward the mountains, scarred by violence but not broken, ready for whatever came next. But even as Mary lost herself in the sweetness of the moment, a part of her remained alert to the sound of Sheriff Morrison's voice as he questioned the captured men. Fletcher might be defeated, but men like him rarely worked alone. And until they knew the full scope of what they were up against, the danger was far from over. The wedding dress hanging in Mary's tiny room above the general store looked like a ghost in the moonlight, white silk that had cost her 3 months of saved wages and every dream she'd carried across the ocean. Tomorrow she would marry James Hartwell, but tonight a letter had arrived that changed everything. Her hands shook as she read the words again, written in the careful script of a man who dealt in legal matters and bad news. "Mrs. O'Brien, it has come to our attention that your late husband Patrick O'Brien owed substantial debts at the time of his death. As his widow, you are legally responsible for payment of $847, plus interest. Failure to satisfy this obligation will result in criminal charges for fraud and theft." The letter was signed by a lawyer in Denver, but Mary recognized the real hand behind it. Fletcher might be sitting in jail, but his reach was longer than anyone had imagined. Someone had dug into her past, found her vulnerabilities, and was now using them like a knife aimed at her heart. $847. It might as well have been $8,000. Mary had maybe $12 to her name, and that was counting the coins hidden in her sock drawer. Even if she worked for James for a full year without spending a penny on food or clothing, she couldn't raise that kind of money. The worst part was that the debt might actually be real. Patrick had been a dreamer, always chasing the next big opportunity, always sure that fortune was just around the corner. He could have borrowed money from anyone, promised anything, left debts scattered across Ireland like seeds in a field. A soft knock on her door made Mary jump. She quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket before opening the door to find Mrs. Henderson from the dress shop, her face creased with worry. "Mary, dear, are you all right? I saw a light under your door and thought, well, it's very late for a bride to be awake the night before her wedding." "Just nervous?" Mary lied, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "You know how it is." Mrs. Henderson studied her with sharp eyes that had seen too much of life to be fooled easily. Child, I've dressed 3 daughters for their weddings, and I know the difference between nervous and terrified. What's happened? The kindness in the older woman's voice nearly broke Mary's carefully maintained composure. She wanted to pour out the whole story, to seek comfort and advice from someone who might understand. But the letter had made one thing crystal clear: involving others in her troubles would only put them in danger too. It's nothing that can't wait until after tomorrow, Mary said, hating herself for the half-truth. Mrs. Henderson didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. Well, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me. A woman's got to look out for other women in this world. After Mrs. Henderson left, Mary sat on her narrow bed and tried to think through her options. She could tell James the truth, but what could he do? A rancher's savings wouldn't cover a debt this size, and she wouldn't ask him to bankrupt himself for her problems. She could run away tonight, disappear into the vast emptiness of the West, and hope that distance would keep her safe. But running would mean abandoning James to face Fletcher's remaining allies alone. Or she could marry James as planned, keep the secret, and hope that somehow they could find a way to fight this new threat together. It was the most dangerous choice because it would make James a target too. But it was also the only choice that didn't involve giving up on the life she'd finally found. As the sun began to rise over the mountains, Mary made her decision. She would marry James Hartwell today, and she would find a way to protect him from the storm that was coming, even if it killed her. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. James stood at the altar that Sheriff Morrison had built from pine boards in front of the little church, watching the door and trying not to fidget with his collar. The whole town had turned out for the ceremony, ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers and their families, even the saloon girls who had closed up early to see the Irish woman marry the grieving widower. Everyone loved a romance, especially one that had been tested by gunfire and emerged stronger. But as the minutes ticked by and Mary failed to appear, James began to worry. Yesterday she had seemed happy, excited about their future together. Today, according to Mrs. Henderson, she looked like a woman facing her own execution. Maybe she changed her mind, suggested Doc Winters, who was standing up as James's best man. Wouldn't be the first bride to get cold feet. No, James said firmly. Mary's not the type to run from anything. Something's wrong. He was about to leave the altar and go looking for her when the church door finally opened. Mary stood framed in the doorway like a vision, beautiful in her white dress but with shadows under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. She walked down the aisle with the measured pace of a woman walking to her doom rather than her destiny. When she reached James's side, he could see the strain around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she took his arm. "Mary," he whispered. "What's wrong?" "Nothing that can't wait," she replied, echoing her words from the night before. Sheriff Morrison opened his Bible and began the ceremony with words that had joined countless couples before them. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of James Hartwell and Mary Catherine O'Brien in holy matrimony." James tried to focus on the familiar words, but his attention kept drifting to Mary's face. Something was terribly wrong, and every instinct he'd developed during years of dealing with difficult cattle and dangerous weather was telling him that his bride was in trouble. When Morrison asked if anyone had reasons why they shouldn't be wed, James half expected someone to stand up and voice an objection. Instead, the church remained silent except for the nervous coughing of old Mr. Peterson and the distant sound of horses approaching town. "Do you, James Hartwell, take Mary Catherine O'Brien to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," James said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "And do you, Mary Catherine O'Brien, take James Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Mary hesitated for just a moment, her eyes meeting James's with an expression that looked almost like an apology. Then she squared her shoulders and spoke the words that would bind their fates together. "I do." As Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, and James leaned down to kiss his bride, the sound of horses grew louder. Through the church windows, James could see a group of riders approaching fast, their dust cloud visible against the morning sky. The kiss was sweet but brief, interrupted by the arrival of strangers who had clearly traveled hard to reach the town before the ceremony concluded. Mary's face went white as she recognized the lead rider, a tall man in an expensive suit who looked out of place in the rough frontier town. "Mrs. Mary O'Brien," the man called out as he dismounted. "Or should I say Mrs. Hartwell now? My name is Charles Pemberton, attorney at law. I have some business to discuss with you regarding your late husband's debts." The telegram that Sheriff Morrison read aloud in the church made Mary's worst fears come true. "Stop the wedding. Mary O'Brien wanted for theft and fraud. Federal marshals en route. Signed, Judge Harrison, Denver District Court." Every face in the church turned toward Mary, expressions shifting from celebration to confusion to suspicion in the space of a heartbeat. She felt the weight of their stares like physical blows, saw the doubt creeping into eyes that had welcomed her just moments before. "That's impossible," James said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "My wife is no thief." The lawyer, Pemberton, smiled with the cold satisfaction of a man who held all the winning cards. "I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise, Mr. Hartwell. Your bride has been living under false pretenses, hiding debts that make her legally a fugitive from justice." Mary wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had known nothing about Patrick's borrowing, that she was as much a victim as anyone. But the words stuck in her throat as she saw the faces of people she had hoped to call neighbors and friends. Mrs. Henderson looked heartbroken. Doc Winters appeared embarrassed that he had vouched for her character. Even Sheriff Morrison seemed uncertain, his hand resting on his gun, as if he might need to arrest the bride at her own wedding. "Show me this evidence," James demanded, stepping protectively in front of Mary. Pemberton produced a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents. Promissory notes signed by Patrick O'Brien, witnessed by 3 different parties. Records of goods purchased on credit and never paid for. A pattern of fraud stretching back 5 years. Mary's heart sank as she recognized Patrick's distinctive handwriting on several of the papers. Her husband had indeed borrowed money, more than she had ever imagined. But the amounts seemed impossible, hundreds of dollars for goods and services that a poor Irish farmer could never have afforded. "These documents are forgeries," she said, finding her voice at last. "Patrick never had access to this kind of money. We were barely surviving." "Are you saying this isn't your husband's signature?" Pemberton asked, holding up a promissory note. Mary looked at the paper and felt her world crumble. It was definitely Patrick's writing, complete with the peculiar way he formed his letters and the small flourish he added to his surname. But the date on the document was wrong. It was signed 6 months after Patrick's death. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Patrick died of fever. I watched him buried." Pemberton's smile grew wider. "Are you certain about that, Mrs. Hartwell? Because I have it on good authority that Patrick O'Brien was seen alive and well in Denver as recently as 3 months ago." The words hit Mary like a physical blow. Around her, the church erupted in whispers and gasps. Someone suggested that maybe Patrick had faked his death to escape his debts. Another voice wondered if Mary had been part of the deception all along. "That's enough." James's voice boomed through the church, silencing the speculation. "I don't care what papers you wave around, or what lies you tell. Mary is my wife now, and I'll stand by her no matter what." The simple declaration of faith broke something loose in Mary's chest. Here was a man who barely knew her, choosing to trust her word over official documents and legal threats. It was more than Patrick had ever given her, more than she had ever dared to hope for. But Pemberton wasn't finished with his performance. "How noble, Mr. Hartwell. But I wonder if you'll feel the same way when you learn that harboring a fugitive makes you an accomplice. Your ranch could be seized to pay her debts. You could face criminal charges yourself." The threat hung in the air like poison. Mary saw James's jaw tighten, but his hand remained steady on her arm. Whatever doubts he might have, he wasn't going to abandon her to face this alone. Sheriff Morrison, Pemberton continued, "I have a federal warrant for Mary O'Brien's arrest. Will you do your duty, or must I wait for the marshals to arrive?" Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable, caught between his respect for James and Mary and his obligation to uphold the law. "I'll need to see that warrant," he said finally. As Pemberton reached into his coat, a new voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary, Charles." Everyone turned to see a woman standing in the church doorway, her traveling dress dusty from hard riding. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Most importantly, she wore a federal marshal's badge pinned to her jacket. "Marshal Catherine Wells," the woman introduced herself. "And Mr. Pemberton, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." The church exploded into chaos as Pemberton tried to run and Sheriff Morrison moved to block his escape. In the confusion, Mary found herself clinging to James, hardly daring to believe that salvation had arrived at the last possible moment. Marshal Wells restored order with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with desperate criminals. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for disrupting your wedding, but I've been tracking a ring of confidence men who prey on recent immigrants, forging documents to create false debts and then extorting money from their victims." She held up a stack of papers that looked identical to the ones Pemberton had produced. "Patrick O'Brien did die of fever, just as his wife reported. These documents are clever forgeries, designed to steal from a woman who had already lost everything." Mary felt tears streaming down her face as the truth finally emerged. Patrick hadn't betrayed her. She wasn't a criminal or a fugitive. The nightmare that had haunted her since yesterday was finally over. "How did you know?" James asked Marshal Wells. "Anonymous tip," Wells replied with a slight smile. "Someone in Denver heard about Pemberton's plan to target Mrs. O'Brien and thought the law should know about it. Took us a while to track him here, but we made it just in time." As Pemberton was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, Mary turned to James with wonder and gratitude shining in her eyes. "You believed me," she said. "Even when the evidence looked bad, you stood by me." "I know who you are," James replied simply. "I've watched you work, watched you fight, watched you choose to stay when leaving would have been safer. That tells me more about your character than any piece of paper ever could." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat, grinning broadly. "Well, now that we've got that sorted out, does anyone know if we're still having a wedding? Because I've got a marriage certificate here that needs signing." The laughter that followed was like a spring rain after a long drought, washing away the fear and suspicion that had poisoned the air. Mary looked around at the faces of people who had doubted her just minutes ago but were now smiling with genuine happiness for her good fortune. "Yes," Mary said, reaching for James's hand. "We're definitely still having a wedding." As they signed the papers that made their union official, Mary caught sight of Marshal Wells slipping quietly out of the church. The woman had saved her life and asked for nothing in return, appearing like an angel and departing just as mysteriously. But there would be time later to wonder about anonymous tips and mysterious saviors. Right now, Mary Catherine O'Brien Hartwell had a new life to begin, a garden to tend, and a love that had already proven itself stronger than lies, stronger than fear, stronger than anything the world could throw at them. The real test would come in the days and years ahead, as they worked together to build something lasting from the ashes of their separate griefs. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by friends and bathed in autumn sunlight, anything seemed possible. The blizzard that trapped Mary and James in their honeymoon cabin was nothing compared to the storm brewing between them as they discovered they were complete strangers who had just promised to spend their lives together. 3 days of being snowed in had stripped away the politeness and careful courtship, revealing two people who knew how to survive alone but had no idea how to live together. "You squeeze the toothpaste from the middle," Mary said, holding up the mangled tube like evidence in a criminal trial. "Who does that?" "People who don't make lists for everything," James shot back, gesturing at the neat rows of paper tacked to every wall of the small cabin. "Do we really need a schedule for when to feed the chickens?" They stood on opposite sides of the tiny kitchen, both breathing hard from their first real fight as husband and wife. Outside, The wind howled through the pine trees, reminding them that they were stuck together until the weather cleared. The romantic getaway that the town ladies had planned for them was turning into a test of whether their marriage would survive its first week. Mary had imagined their honeymoon differently. Quiet talks by the fire, sharing stories about their pasts, learning to be comfortable in each other's company. Instead, they had discovered that James left his clothes wherever he took them off, while Mary folded everything with military precision. He liked to eat meals whenever he felt hungry, while she believed in proper mealtimes. He hummed unconsciously while working, driving her nearly mad with the tuneless sound. "Maybe this was a mistake," Mary said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was louder than the blizzard. James stared at her with an expression that shifted from anger to hurt to something that might have been relief. "Maybe it was," he agreed, his voice carefully neutral. They spent the rest of the day avoiding each other in the cramped space, Mary burying herself in her sewing while James whittled by the fire. The easy companionship they had shared while fighting Fletcher's men seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the awkward reality of two people who had confused shared danger with lasting compatibility. That night, they slept on opposite sides of the small bed, careful not to touch, both pretending to be asleep while staring at the ceiling. Mary found herself thinking about her friend Sarah back in Denver, who had warned her against marrying a man she barely knew. "Just because he's kind and brave doesn't mean you'll be happy together," Sarah had said. "Marriage is about little things, how he chews his food, whether he listens when you talk, if he remembers what matters to you." Mary hadn't listened then, caught up in the romance of their dramatic courtship. Now, lying next to a man who felt like a stranger, she wondered if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The second day was worse. They ran out of coffee, and James blamed Mary for not packing enough supplies. Mary criticized James for not checking the weather reports before they left town. Every small irritation became a major argument, and every argument revealed how different they really were. "You don't talk about your feelings," Mary accused during a fight about how to cook the eggs. "You talk about everything to death," James replied. "Sometimes a man just wants to eat breakfast without analyzing what it means." The words stung because they were partly true. Mary did have a tendency to examine every emotion, every decision, every conversation for hidden meanings. Came from years of being alone, of having no one to share her thoughts with. But James's silence felt like rejection, as if she wasn't worth the effort of real communication. By the third morning, they were barely speaking. Mary made breakfast while James tended the fire, moving around each other like polite strangers sharing a hotel room. The snow had finally stopped, but fresh drifts blocked the door and windows, trapping them for at least another day. "I'm going to clear a path to the woodshed," James announced, pulling on his coat. "Fine," Mary replied without looking up from her mending. But after James had been gone for over an hour, Mary began to worry. The woodshed was only 50 feet from the cabin, and clearing a path shouldn't take that long. She looked out the window but couldn't see him through the glare of sun on snow. Putting on her own coat, Mary forced open the door and waded through knee-deep drifts toward the shed. She found James sitting on a stump, staring out at the white wilderness with an expression of such profound sadness that her anger melted away like snow in spring sunshine. "James?" she said softly. "What's wrong?" He looked up at her with eyes that held too much pain for a man his age. "I've been thinking about Anna," he admitted, "about how easy it was with her. We never fought about toothpaste or schedules or any of the stupid things we've been arguing about." Mary felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it took her breath away. She had been competing with a ghost, trying to measure up to a woman who grew more perfect in memory with each passing year. "Maybe," she said carefully, "that's because you and Anna had time to learn how to be together. You dated for months before you married. We've known each other for 6 weeks." James was quiet for a long time, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Do you think we made a mistake?" he asked finally. Mary considered the question seriously. They were poorly matched in many ways. He was quiet where she was talkative, orderly where she was spontaneous, settled where she was still finding her way. But there was something else too, something that had drawn them together despite their differences. I think, Mary said slowly, that we're trying to be the people we were before instead of figuring out who we are together. What do you mean? Mary sat down on another stump, choosing her words carefully. Anna was your first wife when you were young and everything felt possible. I'm your second wife when you're older and life has taught you to be careful. Patrick was my first husband when I thought love meant never disagreeing. You're my second husband when I've learned that sometimes fighting means caring enough to be honest. James looked at her with something that might have been understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. So what do we do? He asked. We stop trying to recreate what we had before, Mary replied, and we start building something new. The fire that started in the kitchen while Mary was learning to cook James's favorite stew nearly burned down their house. But it also burned away the last of their pretenses about being the perfect couple. Standing in their smoke-filled home, covered in soot and laughing at the disaster they had created together, they finally began to feel like real partners instead of two people playing house. Well, James said, surveying the blackened pots and the scorch marks on the ceiling, that's one way to redecorate. Mary giggled, a sound that surprised them both. She hadn't laughed like that since she was a girl in Ireland, before life taught her that joy was a luxury she couldn't afford. Your mother's stew recipe might need some adjustments. My mother never mentioned what to do if the cook gets distracted arguing politics with her husband, James replied, grinning at her through the haze of smoke. The argument had actually been their first real conversation since the honeymoon disaster. Mary had been reading a newspaper article about women's suffrage while stirring the stew, and James had made a comment about politics being men's business. Instead of the bitter fight that would have erupted a week ago, they had found themselves in a spirited but respectful debate about voting rights and social change. It was during that discussion, while Mary was gesticulating with a wooden spoon to make her point about taxation without representation, that the stew had boiled over and caught fire. By the time they noticed, flames were licking at the kitchen curtains and smoke was filling the house. Working together to put out the fire had been the most natural thing they had done since their wedding. James hauled water while Mary beat out flames with wet towels. They moved in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's needs without words, functioning as the team they were meant to be. I suppose we should clean this up, Mary said, looking at the mess with something that might have been fondness. Later, James replied, taking her soot-stained hand in his. Right now, I want to hear more about why you think women should vote. They ended up talking until well past midnight, sitting on the porch while the house aired out, sharing thoughts and dreams they had been too polite or too scared to voice before. Mary told James about her secret hope to start a school for immigrant children. James admitted that he had always wanted to try growing exotic plants in a greenhouse, even though his neighbors would think it was foolish. Anna thought I was too practical, he said, staring up at the stars. She was always the dreamer in our marriage. But with you. With me, what? Mary prompted when he trailed off. With you, I find myself wanting to dream again. The words hung between them, fragile as spider webs but stronger than the careful politeness they had been hiding behind. Mary felt something shift in her chest, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. James, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. He turned to look at her, and she saw wariness creep into his expression. They had shared enough revelations for one lifetime, and he was probably expecting another crisis. I've been comparing myself to Anna, Mary continued, trying to be the kind of wife she was, trying to fill her place instead of making my own. But I'm not Anna, and I never will be. No, James agreed softly. You're not. The words should have hurt, but they didn't. Instead, they felt like freedom. I'm louder than she was, Mary said. I have opinions about politics and business and things that proper ladies aren't supposed to care about. I burn dinner and argue with my husband and make lists for everything because I'm afraid of forgetting something important. Yes, James said, and there was something in his voice that made Mary look at him more closely. I'll never be the perfect, gentle wife that Anna was, Mary finished. Good, James said firmly, because I don't want Anna back. I want you. The simple declaration hit Mary harder than any elaborate speech could have. For the first time since their wedding, she felt truly seen and truly wanted for exactly who she was. "Even if I keep burning dinner?" she asked. "Even if you burn down the whole house," James replied. "We'll build a new one." Their second kiss as a married couple was different from their first. Less desperate, more certain. It tasted of smoke and new beginnings, of two people who had finally stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be real. When they finally went inside, the house still smelled like disaster, but it felt like home. The next morning brought news that changed everything once again. Sheriff Morrison arrived at dawn with a telegram that made Mary's hands shake as she read it. "What is it?" James asked, seeing her face go pale. "It's from Marshal Wells," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fletcher escaped from custody. He killed a guard and 2 other prisoners getting out. They think he's heading back here." James took the telegram and read it himself, his jaw growing tighter with each word. When? 3 days ago. He could already be in the territory. They stared at each other across their smoke-damaged kitchen, both understanding what this meant. Fletcher was a man with nothing left to lose, and he blamed them for destroying his plans. He wouldn't just be coming for the land anymore, he would be coming for revenge. "We could leave," Mary said without much conviction. "Sell the ranch and start over somewhere else." "We could," James agreed. "But would we ever stop running? Would we ever feel safe?" Mary thought about the life they were just beginning to build together, the dreams they had shared under the stars, the home they were creating from love and stubbornness and burned stew. Running would mean giving up everything they had fought for. "No," she said finally. "I'm tired of running. This is our home now." "Then we stay and fight," James said. "Together." "Together," Mary agreed. But as they began making plans to defend their ranch and their marriage, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the hills above their valley. Fletcher had indeed returned, and he had brought help. The kind of help that didn't ask questions and didn't leave witnesses. The battle for their future was about to begin, and this time, there might not be a sheriff arriving just in time to save them. The poison that killed their milk cow wasn't meant for the animal. It was meant for Mary and James. Hidden in the well water they drank every morning with their coffee. Only Thunder's desperate thirst after breaking through his fence had saved their lives. And now the massive bull lay dying in agony while his owners watched helplessly. "Easy, boy," James whispered, stroking Thunder's neck as the animal's breathing grew shallow and labored. "Easy now." Mary knelt beside them, her medical knowledge from tending sick neighbors telling her that nothing could be done. The poison, probably strychnine from the way Thunder's muscles were seizing, had done its work too well. All they could do was stay with the faithful bull until the end. "This is my fault," Mary said, tears streaming down her face. "If I hadn't insisted on staying, if I had just left when the trouble started." "Stop," James said firmly. "Fletcher made his choices. We made ours. Don't you dare blame yourself for what that monster does." But Mary could see the fear in her husband's eyes, the same terror that was eating at her own heart. Fletcher wasn't just trying to drive them away anymore, he was trying to kill them. The game had changed from business to murder, and they were completely outmatched. Thunder shuddered once more and then lay still, his loyal heart finally giving up the fight. Mary and James sat in the morning sunlight beside their dead friend, both understanding that they had just seen a preview of their own fate if they couldn't find a way to stop Fletcher. "We need help," Mary said finally. "Real help. Not just Sheriff Morrison and his 2 deputies. "From who?" James asked bitterly. "The Army won't get involved in civilian disputes. The federal marshals are already chasing Fletcher. Our neighbors are too scared to stand up to him." Mary wiped her eyes and stood up, her mind already working on the problem. She had spent her life finding solutions when none seemed to exist, surviving on wit and determination when strength and numbers failed her. "Not our neighbors," she said slowly. "But what about people who have their own reasons to hate Fletcher?" James looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Fletcher has been terrorizing this valley for years. We're not his first victims, and we won't be his last if he wins. There have to be other people he's hurt, other families he's destroyed. What if we could find them? The idea was dangerous and probably hopeless, but it was better than sitting around waiting to be murdered. Over the next 3 days, while taking elaborate precautions against more poisoning attempts, Mary and James began reaching out to Fletcher's other victims. The stories they uncovered were heartbreaking. A Mexican family driven off their land when Fletcher claimed they had no legal right to it. A widow whose husband died in a suspicious accident after refusing to sell his water rights. A group of Chinese miners who had their claims jumped and their equipment destroyed when they struck a rich vein of silver. He's been doing this for 10 years, Mary said, reading through the letters and testimonies they had collected, building his empire one stolen property at a time, and getting away with it because his victims were all outsiders, James added grimly. People the law didn't care about protecting. But Mary had also discovered something else in her research. Fletcher's methods were becoming more violent and less careful. The man who had once relied on legal tricks and intimidation was now resorting to outright murder, which meant he was either getting desperate or losing his mind. He's made a mistake, she told James as they prepared for bed on their 3rd night of investigation. All these years, he's been careful to stay just inside the law, or at least maintain plausible deniability. But poisoning our well, killing Thunder, that's evidence even a corrupt judge couldn't ignore. Evidence we can't use if we're dead, James pointed out. Mary had to admit he was right. They were gathering proof of Fletcher's crimes, but they were also making themselves bigger targets with every person they contacted. Word was getting back to Fletcher that the Hartwells were building a case against him, and his response was escalating violence. The next morning brought proof of that escalation. Mary found a note pinned to their front door with a knife, the blade driven so deep into the wood that it took James's full strength to pull it free. 2 days. The note read in crude handwriting. Pack up and leave, or we'll bury you beside your bull. This time there was no signature, no pretense of legal authority. Just a naked threat delivered with the kind of violence that promised much worse to come. He's not even trying to hide anymore, Mary observed, studying the note. That means he's past caring about consequences. Or he's confident there won't be any, James replied darkly. They spent that day making preparations that felt like writing their own funeral arrangements. James cleaned and loaded every gun on the ranch while Mary preserved food and gathered medical supplies. They wrote letters to family members they might never see again and hid copies of their evidence in places where hopefully someone would find them after their deaths. But as the sun set on what might be their last day alive, Mary found herself thinking not about dying but about living. About the garden she had restored from ruin, the love she had found in the ashes of her old life, the home she and James were building together. I'm not ready to give up, she said suddenly, startling James from his own dark thoughts. Neither am I, he replied. But I don't see how 2 people can fight an army. Mary looked out at the valley spread below their ranch, thinking about all the people who called this place home. Honest families trying to build something good in a harsh land. Immigrants like herself who had come west looking for a chance to start over. Working people who just wanted to be left alone to live their lives in peace. Maybe we're not just 2 people, she said slowly. Maybe we're the beginning of something bigger. James followed her gaze across the valley, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. You want to organize the whole territory against him. I want to show people that they don't have to be afraid anymore, Mary replied. That if we stand together, we can protect what we've built. It was an impossible dream, the kind of wild scheme that got good people killed. But as Mary looked at her husband's face in the lamplight, she saw her own determination reflected back at her. All right, James said quietly. Let's see if we can start a revolution. The meeting that would decide their fate took place in the abandoned mine shaft where no one could see who came or went, and where Fletcher's spies couldn't overhear the plans being made. 23 people showed up in the darkness. Far more than Mary had dared to hope for, but still pitifully few against Fletcher's army of hired guns. This is suicide, muttered Carl Peterson, the aging rancher whose cattle had been mysteriously poisoned the year before. Fletcher has 30 men, maybe more. We're farmers and shopkeepers, not soldiers. We're people who are tired of being afraid, Mary replied, standing before the group like a general addressing her troops. Fletcher has spent years picking us off one by one, making each family think they were alone. But we're not alone anymore. In the flickering light of oil lamps, she could see faces marked by fear and hardship, but also by a growing determination. These were people who had come west to build new lives, and they were finally ready to fight for them. Doc Winters spoke up from the back of the group. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Hartwell? Because if we're going to take on Fletcher, we need more than good intentions." Mary had spent days thinking about this moment, planning every word she would say. Fletcher's strength comes from people believing he's untouchable, that the law won't protect decent folks from his kind of evil. But what if we could prove he's just another criminal? What if we could show the territorial governor exactly what he's been doing? She gestured to James, who began distributing copies of the evidence they had gathered. Murder, arson, cattle poisoning, illegal land seizures. We have witnesses and proof for all of it. But only if we can keep those witnesses alive long enough to testify. "And how do we do that?" asked Maria Santos, the Mexican woman whose family had been driven from their home. "Fletcher will kill anyone who speaks against him." "Not if we all speak at once," Mary replied. "Not if we make it clear that murdering one of us means war with all of us." The plan she outlined was simple but dangerous. Every person in the room would sign a formal complaint against Fletcher, detailing his crimes and demanding justice. The documents would be delivered simultaneously to the territorial governor, the Federal Marshal Service, and every newspaper in the territory. Fletcher would wake up one morning to find himself the most wanted man in Wyoming, with no place to hide and no one left to intimidate. "It could work," said Tom Bradley, the blacksmith whose shop had been burned when he refused to shoe Fletcher's horses for free. "But it's still dangerous. Fletcher won't go down without a fight." "Then we'd better be ready to fight back," James said grimly. "Because running hasn't worked and hiding hasn't worked. This is our last chance to take our lives back." One by one, the people in the mine shaft stepped forward to sign the documents. Some signed quickly, with the decisive strokes of people who had made up their minds long ago. Others hesitated, weighing the risks against the hope of finally being free from Fletcher's tyranny. But in the end, they all signed. 23 names on 23 separate complaints, each one a declaration of war against the man who had terrorized their valley for too long. "The documents go out tomorrow morning," Mary announced when the last signature was dry. "After that, there's no turning back. Fletcher will know exactly who his enemies are." "Good," said old Mrs. Chun, whose mining claim had been stolen by Fletcher's men. "I'm tired of being afraid of shadows. Let him come into the light where we can all see him for what he is." As the meeting broke up and people began slipping away into the night, Mary felt a mixture of triumph and terror. They had taken the first step toward ending Fletcher's reign of terror, but they had also painted targets on all their backs. "Think it will work?" James asked as they walked home under a sky full of stars. "It has to," Mary replied, "because the alternative is letting evil win." But neither of them slept well that night, both listening for the sound of approaching horses that would signal Fletcher's response to their rebellion. When morning came without an attack, they began to hope that maybe their plan was working. That hope lasted exactly 4 hours. The explosion that destroyed the town's telegraph office also killed the operator and set fire to 3 neighboring buildings. Fletcher's message was clear. No word of their rebellion would reach the outside world, and anyone who tried to help them would pay the same price. Standing in the ruins of their communication with civilization, Mary felt the weight of what they had done. 23 families had put their trust in her leadership, and now they were all trapped in a valley with a madman who had nothing left to lose. "The documents never went out," James said grimly, surveying the wreckage. "Fletcher made sure of that." Mary nodded, feeling the bitter taste of failure in her mouth. But as she looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people who had believed in her enough to risk everything, she realized that the real test wasn't whether their plan had worked. The real test was what they did next. "Then we deliver them in person," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd that had gathered around the smoking ruins. "Fletcher can't blow up every road out of the territory. Someone will get through. And if Fletcher catches them? Carl Peterson asked. Mary met his eyes steadily. Then the rest of us keep trying until someone succeeds. Because that's what people do when they refuse to surrender their freedom. It wasn't the victory she had hoped for, but it wasn't defeat either. It was the moment when 23 separate families became one community, united by a shared determination to protect what they loved. The war for their valley was just beginning, and Mary Hartwell intended to win it.